Patuwaste, everyone. Good day. Thank you for joining us for another video talking about our resource opportunities. In a previous video, we recapped what HESAPA, our acronym, our version of SWAPA plus H plus E, and what HESAPA stands for. As a quick recap, it stands for humans, energy, soil, animals, plants, air, and water. These are the 7 resource categories that we can sort our natural resources into and consider when we are developing our conservation and land stewardship management plans. When it comes to conservation of HESAPA, we have several principles that we really like to promote here at the Intertribal Agriculture Council, and that's truly what this video is designed to cover. Some just foundational principles that we should think about as we are developing our conservation plans. The first is that we must look at the big picture. Here we see a piece of soil that really looks more like dirt, right? There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of life in the soil because there's no vegetation cover. It looks like there was some animals here at some point, but there really doesn't seem to be any recent healthy hoof impact. We don't see a whole lot of wildlife or any sort of ground creatures to crawl across this landscape, and I don't blame them. It looks pretty barren. And we could really focus in on this issue, and we could realize how it's such a concern to us, and there's so much opportunity to improve it. We really could emphasize our need to fix this one little issue. But if we were to step back from this picture and look at the whole picture, we can realize that this is obviously in a working corral system, right? How we can see that this is the structure surrounding this piece of soil was actually used to probably recently hold animals through a feeding season or to sort them, to prepare them to go out to grass. And there's probably what you aren't seeing in this picture off to the left-hand side is that there's a barn where a lot of rainfall falls off of with every rainstorm. And this picture was taken in early spring. You can kind of see the grass greening up on the horizon back there. And so it's critical to remember that we have to look at the big picture. And I find often that land stewards can be really critical of their land resources and their natural resource categories. And when they're reviewing their HESAPA, they may have one particular resource category that they really want to focus in on. Let's take into consideration certain pests that they may find to be an issue, or certain wildlife that they may find to be an issue, and they really want to focus in on that one species or that one piece of land that might only be an acre or 2 patch that seems to be impacted, and they want to fix that problem that they've identified. But really what needs to happen most often as land stewards is we need to take a step back and we need to say, hey, why does this problem exist? What are some of the natural solutions to this problem? You know, if it's that you have a really excessive prairie dog problem, you know, have you removed all of the natural predators that hunt prairie dogs? Or is your soil health so poor that it's not infiltrating enough water and your soil is dry enough that it's a good home for prairie dogs, right? You know, prairie dogs won't build a home where the soil is so healthy that their home's going to flood all the time. And so we have to then think about our grazing practices and how does that relate to soil health? And, you know, we have to think big picture and long term and from one production year to the next. We really can't be too hypercritical and zoom in on the smallest little issue that we see and make it the biggest issue, because most often, you know, the only way we can help our resource opportunities to grow and to develop is to really look at things on a holistic approach. Timing matters, all right? So here we see a picture of May 1st and a really what looks to be pretty low vegetative output across a draw here in central South Dakota on the Cheyenne River Sioux Indian Reservation. It looks like, you know, maybe the grass was clipped off late season last year. and perhaps maybe grazed throughout the winter. There really doesn't seem to be a whole lot of vegetative activity yet as of May 1st. And what this particular producer did was they actually removed the livestock coming into the end of April to give this piece of land a rest and to allow the vegetation to really utilize those spring showers that were starting to come through. You know, the ground was still starting to thaw. Winter was just saying goodbye in South Dakota at this time this year. And merely 20 days later, you see the difference. Now, the reason that I've utilized this comparison for timing matters is because in just 20 days, we were able to see so much vegetative productivity because the growing season had just started. If we still had animals out here on this piece of land, we wouldn't have really been able to notice the impact that greatly in just a 20-day span because the animals would have been eating the green grass and the shrubs and the forbs as they were to grow. And so if we were to do this similar 20-day rest period and comparison photo in, say, December or, even in late fall, like October or November, we really wouldn't have seen such a vivid comparison within just 20 days. Because the growing season has already gone. And while the rest period would still be good, it doesn't really allow for those new plants to get their hold and to grow the way that this rest period has when we timed it out perfectly with all of the cool season species that we're going to grow this spring in South Dakota. So timing matters. This is something to consider if your conservation management plan implements any burning or any particular rotating of your grazing or even planting. Timing truly matters because we have to consider the natural impact of our ecosystems, the frosts, when the rains are coming, when the moisture is coming, when the pollinators are there, or when the pests are there. This is something, we all have our cultural teachings. There's some plants here in the Northern Great Plains that when they're flowering, that's when we were planting our seeds. So we listened to nature, right? We took indications from nature. Sometimes when the wonkias, the thunders were to come back, that's when we knew it was time to prepare for particular harvests. Or as the birds would migrate through, we knew that winter might be coming and we need to start, doing the last bit of foraging that we needed to get through the winter. And so when we plan for our conservation management, we have to consider timing of nature and Mother Nature, not just the timing of our personal schedule and when we would like to do our herd health management or harvest our crops. We need to consider nature because, Mother Nature, she's a lot bigger and stronger than any of us are as land stewards. Biodiversity is essential. The more diverse your ecosystem can be, the more resilient and withstanding it can be of the various pressures or droughts or excessive rainfall and moisture. Here we have a picture of a mountain watershed in the what's referred to as Racine Basin. This is a really beautiful photo. It shows so much diversity. And when this photo was shown to me by Mr. Ross Racine, I said to him, wow, look at all that diversity, because it's a little different than the Great Plains pictures that I'm used to in South Dakota. And he actually said, oh, but you should have seen it. And it sounded as though in the story that he told me, there used to be even more vegetative diversity. There was more plant activity, more wildlife activity. And in recent years, this is a part of a national park, or right next to a national park, that had developed a trail that was often utilized not just afoot, but also with UTVs and ATVs right there through the basin. And as a result of the increased human activity, it had started to push animals away. And when the animals and the wildlife started to leave, the plant vegetative community wasn't being impacted the way that it had been impacted for years. And then we started to see a shift in the plant community. And as the plant community started to shift, well, the soil structure started to change because there wasn't as much ground cover. And so we start to see these shifts in diversity really simply as a result, most often, of the human impact. So we really need to consider in HESAPA that humans are one of the most impactful components and categories of resource opportunities. Root systems of prairie plants. This picture here, I think, indicates the importance of diversity in our plant relatives. So we can see what this picture shows is the amount of plant cover above ground is somewhat of an indication of the root structure below ground, but what we see above ground is only half the picture. So as we are going out there and looking at our plants and managing for plant cover and vegetative productivity above ground, we need to think about the soil health below ground and what those plants are telling us, right? What are the plants telling us about the soil? The more diverse your plant community is, the more diverse your soil community is, and the more ability it'll have to withstand severe changes such as drought or disease or pressure. You know, if we had a bison herd come through here and graze off all of these plants here pictured all the way down to the ground, you know, you can see that some plants here don't have a very deep or strong root system, and those plants might not be able to come back next year. But those plants that have the very deep, resilient, strong root system will probably be able to build up or gather enough sugars and nutrients from the soil to be able to grow back the next year. Here's a picture that I like to use to show this. In a previous recording, I mentioned to you that the grass was just starting to green up because I wanted to indicate that different plant species were at different points in their life cycle. The reality is, while they are starting to green up, this ended up being a drought year for us in South Dakota. And so while we're starting to see some green here in this piece of land, that was about as green as it got that year because the rainfall turned off and we didn't have a whole lot of rain that year. But what you can see is there's diversity in plants here. And so all of these shrubs, some of the forbs as well, you can see some sagebush plants there too, they actually had really deep taproot systems. So their roots reached deep into the soil profile and they were able to access the moisture that existed down there. Even though the top layer of soil wasn't getting any rainfall, it wasn't getting watered by the rain, it still had access to water. And so they were able to maintain their green growth through most of the year. And they actually helped to increase the soil moisture content towards the surface because of the capillary action and the flow of water from deep in the soil profile up to the plant leaves. And the other grasses were able to benefit from this activity. And what happened next year in the similar pasture when we did have rain, oh boy, did the plants flourish. So you can see the difference in coloration here and how green all of the plants are. And this next year, the next growing season, we had a very abundant rainfall in the spring and we were very fortunate. And what you see here is some of the same shrub species and forbs that helped us to maintain the grass productivity the year prior in the drought. They were still thriving. They were starting to grow more. They were benefiting from the rainfall that was coming, but they also are an indication of how resilient that landscape was able to be in the year prior because they weren't picked over. They weren't over harvested from the browsing species of the wildlife. And so management matters from one year to the next. And as much as you can, we have to consider that biodiversity is so essential in withstanding the pressures. So we should really try to focus our management to increase biodiversity. The more plant species, the more wildlife species, the better, because the more resilient our ecosystem will be to those pressures. Organism health is indicative of ecosystem health. So we can take a look at the organisms that exist and really directly correlate that to how healthy the ecosystem functioning around those organisms are. And I need to get some better pictures to show this off, but here's a really great example, right? So we see two animals, look to be the same breed of cow to me. And what we're seeing here though is one animal is much more plump and fuller bodied than the other. And what this could be an indication of is a difference in feed source, or nutritional value of the feed. It could be age difference in the animal. One animal could be younger, one could be older, one could be growing a calf, one could be a mama that is still bred, and one could be a cow that does not have a young one to take care of. But what we can consider against this cow herd, or any animals, from one day to the next, is kind of doing a visual assessment. What's their body condition like? Do they look healthier than a month ago? Do they look like their body might be, fighting some sort of pest, or maybe that they're not getting the nutritional value that they need from the land and they're starting to lose weight? Are they gaining too much weight? Are they on too lush of a grass? And these are all indications, very easy indications, visual indications that we can identify organism health to ecosystem health. And it doesn't matter if you have livestock or not, because the wildlife can also tell us this story. There are particular wildlife species that will actually, based on the abundance of resources, will produce more or less offspring in a given reproduction cycle. There are some research indicates, that when there's a decline in wildlife species from overhunting or, maybe natural disaster, the mothers will actually generate larger, they'll have a larger reproduction year. So they'll generate larger batches of their kids or of their pups. Coyotes are an example of this. And so we need to consider that the wildlife, how many of them that are there, as well as how healthy they look, are direct indications of our ecosystem health. And it's all organisms in general. We can think to our own communities and how healthy our people are. That's often an indication to how healthy the ecosystem is in the food system that surrounds them. So we need to consider, are the wildlife, do they look to be thriving? Is their coats shiny, or are they kind of losing some hair? Do they seem to be battling some pests, or maybe some bugs or intestinal pests, such as worms or different things that our ecosystem isn't able to keep in balance? Conservation doesn't have to be too expensive to implement. This is one of the worst excuses I have ever heard for why people don't implement more conservation practices. I personally do agree that every producer, every individual that has a relationship with the land and natural resources would implement more conservation practices and management if they could afford to. A lot of our producers are in very harmful or hard to navigate systems of financing that prevent them from being able to invest as much money as they would like to into their enhancing their natural resource management infrastructure. But there's a lot of shifts producers can make that cost no money in improving their conservation management. And we'll talk about just a few, but I just want to really emphasize that conservation does not have to be too expensive. And so here's an example. We see in this picture the reddish tall grass that seems to be rather, sticky, I would call it. It's an old stand of little bluestem. And little bluestem is a phenomenal forage when it's young and green and lush. But this was a picture taken in the winter, and the stand of little bluestem was actually not anything that the cattle or the wildlife even would graze. Even though the snow hadn't come yet and there was room for them to graze, they didn't want to eat this because it was too dry, and the texture of it wouldn't be as appealing as going off and grazing uh, a softer plant. So what we did was we actually put our supplemental mineral tubs right out there in the middle of that little blue stem patch. And the livestock, they walked to it from all parts of the pasture. And within just a few days, the hoof impact had drove that little blue stem stand back into the soil, and it put that old vegetative stand back in touch with the soil so that the soil would be able to better degrade it. In addition, look at all that natural fertilizer in clumps that we have surrounding that mineral block. And the picture on the right-hand side is actually what was able to grow back that spring. It's a similar place. I went back to where we had this lick tub placed out, and we start to see new stands of little blue stem coming up, and we even see some forbs in there too. We see more diversity because we removed the old vegetative stand in a way that was productive and conducive to regeneration of the healthy soil and the vegetative stand. So we're starting to see the green, lush production that the cattle will now be able to enjoy and graze in this growing season. Now, one thing I want to, point out is that this sort of location-based management really did all of the work itself. We went out one day and I placed out the mineral tubs, and then a couple of days later, when I was checking cows, when it got to this size in the picture, I set it on its side and I rolled it a little ways to where the stand wasn't quite impacted so much, and I was able to just place the cattle out there grazing near the tub so that they could come and lick and get the mineral off of it. And that impact that we saw for the next growing season and beyond was so phenomenal. The production was even higher, and it didn't cost me anything. These were lick tubs I was going to put out already. I just had to shift my placement of them and to manage the placement of them over time. Better practices are more important than Band-Aids. So one of the issues that we had realized in the Northern Great Plains is we get large rainfall events, 2 to 3 inches of rain at a time, sometimes in the early spring, when our plants haven't had enough time to grow yet to slow down the rainfall. And sometimes, we have snow melting at the same time as we have water falling from the sky in the form of rain. And what happens when this takes place is that we have an abundance of water flow because our soil is so saturated. There's so much water already in the soil that it can't take in any more water. And so the water has to flow somewhere. And so here we are seeing a draw, a creek, if you would, that has so much water flowing through it. And you can see right at the head of that creek, right where the flat part of where the water is flowing starts to fall straight down into kind of that cut bank area. There's a smattering, the remains of what was an old hay bale. And so one of the things that we tried to do on our ranch, which was a cheap fix for us, it wasn't too expensive. One way to improve the amount of vegetative cover here would be to fence off that creek line so that no animals ever graze that creek line, and so that the water flow doesn't produce so much soil erosion. Well, to try to mitigate the soil erosion in the coming season, what we did is we went out and we put an old hay bale right there at the mouth of the creek to kind of serve as a buffer and to slow down the water flow before it hit the bare soil of the creek. And the impact that this slowing of the water flow was able to do downstream or down the creek was absolutely phenomenal. In the next year, we can now see, I went to go visit this pretty little colt here. His name is Semi. And look at how lush that creek bank or the creek bottom is. You know, that used to be all gumbo flat, we would call it. It would be black, bare soil. Kind of in the upper right hand side of this picture here, you can kind of see the bare soil that I'm talking about. There was no vegetative cover. And in simply slowing down the water flow upstream or further up the watershed, we were able to slow the water flow down enough so that this vegetative cover was able to take place. So much to the fact that in going to go check that little stud colt, I ran into a washout because I could not see. This is a washout that was usually exposed, but because of all the vegetative production, I wasn't able to see it this time. But what I want to recognize that this is just a Band-Aid. And what the Band-Aid is me placing that hay bale there to slow down the water flow, because the soil health isn't quality enough for all of the rainfall to go into the water. This picture was not taken after a 2 to 3 inch rainfall event. This was only after a nice slow drizzle across the morning, when the ground had already been wet from a previous rainfall. And you know, we might have got a ½ inch of rain accumulated, and that's how much rainfall had rolled off of the hills into that creek. And this wasn't an indication to me of a heavy rainfall event because I knew how much rain fell. It wasn't that heavy. This is actually an indication to me that this piece of land, these hills here, they were tired. Their soil was not healthy enough to take in all of the water. And with not enough ability to have the water infiltrate into these soils, it just had to roll down the hill and come through the wash and go down into the river later down the watershed. What a producer wants is for the rain to fall, to hit the soil, and to go drain directly into the soil so that it can replenish and recharge the groundwater surface, as well and supply, as well as provide the water that's needed for vegetative productivity. So this was an indication to me that this piece of land was probably getting grazed too heavily, too often. And so we really started to shift our management practices of when we would graze this piece of land. Since then, I have not seen a whole lot of rainfall events of this type that have caused this reaction. The pasture is doing much better, but I needed to, as a land steward, I needed to really reflect and realize that while I had placed a Band-Aid there and I'd worked to fix the soil erosion that was taking place, the Band-Aid was only indicating to me that there were bigger problems at play. Now, one of the principles that we should consider when we assess the health of our ecosystems is the resilience. How resilient is our animal herd, our wildlife, our people? How resilient are the plants? So resilience is in an organism's ability to withstand pressure and to bounce back after the pressure. So I like this picture here of the dandelion because to me it shows a pretty resilient plant source. Most dandelions that we see sprout up, they have a stem and leaves that stand up off the ground and bounce in the wind and flow in the wind so that the pollinators can come and be attracted. But it looks as though, you know, there's some pavement or paved blocks here on the soil. And so to me, when I see these dandelions still growing up through the cracks of the pavement, where there's obviously a lot of foot traffic, and when there's not foot traffic, I would argue that wherever this picture was taken, they probably don't want a whole lot of vegetation there. That's why they paved the pieces of soil. And so this plant is expressing a lot of resilience. Even though there's an excessive level of compaction on the soil, there's a lot of foot traffic and disturbance, the plant has found a way to survive and to still complete its life cycle without, dying off. You know, we see this plant has gone to flower already, and that's quite phenomenal because usually this plant needs much more leaf area to generate the energy that it needs to go to flower. So this depicts a really resilient flower. And when we have resilient ecosystems, we see production through even poor management. And the pictures here show some pieces of land or pictures of some of the land around the infrastructure on our ranch that really just hasn't ever seen any animal impact. Most often it would get mowed every year, and finally I got sick of what I think is wasting the grass and mowing it, and I decided, you know what, we're going to put some animals out there. So we put some hot wire fence up, and we threw a couple of cows out there, and in just a few days we saw the impact of them grazing the soil. And you can see the Snapchats that I took here because I was so excited to actually, have the soil have more animal impact again. And the unique thing about this is in the next year, what we were able to see is an even increased abundance of plant activity. So these plants were so resilient that they were able to handle poor pressure and lack of pressure. But when we applied the appropriate pressure, we saw an immediate decrease in the introduced species that we didn't really want, and an increase in the desirable plant species, the nicer grasses, more of the forbs that weren't quite so invasive. And so resilience in our plant community is so important because we're able to then withstand differences in exposure and management types. And it gives us the leniency that we need as land managers to once in a while make mistakes and to learn from our mistakes. Plants and organisms can also have a resistance feature. And I have a picture of a thistle here that has little tiny sharp spines all around the plant. Now this is the plant's natural defense or resistance against the animals that have been grazing or the impact on the piece of soil here. This picture was actually taken from a kind of overused piece of farmland that had been in conventional tillage practices, that had an excessive exposure to pesticides and herbicides to improve the conventional crop stand. And, really this is Mother Nature's Band-Aid. She's putting out this plant that is undesirable to any grazing animals to try to deter any impact or any use of that soil so that it can kind of heal and recover and recuperate. So this is this soil's resistance to pressure by putting up the thistle and holding that soil in place so that it can heal. Ecosystems are constantly responding to pressure, and they will use resistance and resilience to do this. And here's a great example. This is the similar patch of land that I just talked to you about that was in conventional agriculture. And you'll notice that that's pretty much the only stand that exists there is the weeds or the thistle here. And Mother Nature was trying to say, I need a break. The soil needs rest. The soil needs a different form of impact than what it's been currently exposed to. And this is as a result of the pressure that had been put on it in the management practices in the years prior. And so when we start to see organisms in our ecosystem, every organism is holding a role in the ecosystem. And we have to just kind of step back and again, look at that big picture, interpret the resilience and the resistance presented by that organism, and identify, why does that organism exist? What is its role? How is it impacting my choices as a manager, or how will my choices as a land steward impact that organism? We see right here is the actual zoomed back image of the piece of land that had been putting up the thistle. And really what we see is surrounding the thistle on the banks of that field is some smooth brome grass, which isn't the most desirable stand for most producers, but it's better and more desirable than the thistle for most producers. And the thistle is only where it had been tilled time and time again, and where the spraying of the chemicals had taken place. And so really the thistle is just indicating that, hey, I don't need any animals grazing on me right now. I need some rest. I need to recover and recuperate. And the soil right next to it that hadn't been exposed to the excessive tillage and disturbance and chemicals was actually a very desirable grazing grass species. So Mother Nature was saying right next to the thistle, don't graze me here, but here's a place where you can graze that can withstand the impact. And when we zoom out and we look at the large picture, we can see across the highway there that there's actually a field that is still in the same old management practice of tillage and chemical use that has bare soil. And so what this particular thistle is doing, the role that it's holding is it's holding that soil down. And, that night, I'm sure there was a gorgeous sunset because there was probably some soil erosion that took place with the wind that undoubtedly come through South Dakota. And when that soil was leaving the field across the road, it was actually being held in place by the thistle on this side of the road. So every organism holds a role. And ideally, we, through our management practices, can get to a point in our management where we are supporting healthy, resilient, resistant plant species that are as desirable as can be. And each organism is happy and in balance and healthy in holding the role that it's designed to hold in our ecosystems.